Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to objectively deconstruct the primary arguments and themes from a highly engaged broadcast of The Scott Jennings Show. If you've ever found yourself wondering how modern political media builds its daily narratives, well, you're in exactly the right place. We're not here to take sides or debate the politics. Instead, we're here to see exactly how this broadcast moves its audience from local culture debates to international crises, and finally, to deeply unifying historical missions. To really understand the messaging driving today's conservative commentary, we have to look at how this single source seamlessly weaves together state elections, foreign policy, and historical reverence. It's a genuinely fascinating look at media strategy. You see, the broadcast doesn't just list out isolated news items, it curates them to build a comprehensive worldview for its listeners. By examining this specific broadcast, we can see exactly how a single episode connects the dots between a local race down in Texas and naval maneuvers over in the Middle East. Here's how we've organized the show's wide-ranging topics for our thematic deep dive today. First, domestic elections and culture wars. Then, foreign policy regarding Iran negotiations. Third, investigating major government fraud. Fourth, sanctuary cities and public safety. And finally, honoring our fallen veterans. Let's get right into it. Section 1. Domestic elections and culture wars. Contrasting candidate rhetoric. The broadcast opened up by really emphasizing these stark ideological divides in upcoming elections, specifically contrasting Texas Democrat James Tallarico with Republican Ken Paxton. On one hand, they played audio of Tallarico advocating for a strictly vegan campaign to fight the climate crisis, asserting there are 6 biological sexes and arguing for gender-neutral theology. The show framed this as being entirely out of touch with the average Texan. On the exact opposite end of the spectrum, they highlighted Ken Paxton's success by aligning with the Make America Healthy Again movement. A guest reporter noted he is actively suing companies like Lululemon over toxic chemicals in consumer goods, effectively framing him as a warrior for suburban moms who are concerned about health and safety. Then, shifting gears from Texas over to Maine, the analyst highlighted this exact quote from Democratic Senate candidate Graham Plattner regarding legendary American sniper Chris Kyle. The broadcast essentially allowed the controversial rhetoric to just speak for itself. Plattner suggested that Kyle shot innocent civilians in Iraq to inflate his numbers. The host then brought in commentary from Chris Kyle's widow, Taya Kyle, who called the remarks cowardly and a cheap political trick. This brilliantly illustrates how the broadcast uses highly emotional, character-driven controversies to motivate its audience and draw incredibly sharp distinctions between political factions. Moving on to Section 2, Foreign Policy. Iran negotiations, diplomacy versus defense. Moving from local elections to high-stakes global issues, the source analyzed the very tense diplomatic negotiations happening right now between the U.S. and Iran. The host brought on Hudson Institute national security analyst Rebecca Heinrichs, who expressed some serious skepticism about diplomacy here. She cited recent intelligence that Iranian forces, specifically the IRGC, are actively laying mines in the Strait of Hormuz and firing surface-to-air missiles at U.S. aircraft. Furthermore, Heinrichs argued that previous strikes have so severely degraded Iranian leadership that it's honestly unclear who even holds the political reins to negotiate anymore. Her ultimate conclusion presented on the show was that U.S. Central Command needs to take far more robust, defensive military operations rather than relying on stalled diplomatic talks. Next up is Section 3, Investigating Major Government Fraud, the Financial Scale. The explainer then pivots to domestic administration, outlining some truly staggering claims of government financial mismanagement. Get this, Vice President Vance's task force claims to have referred an astounding $22 billion in fraudulent small business loans back to the Treasury for collection. The broadcast framed this not just as pocket change, but as a massive systemic failure in how government funds were distributed, particularly during recent emergency relief periods. To put that into perspective, that is an astronomical amount of taxpayer money. And the broadcast immediately followed that up with another massive figure, citing $6.3 billion in suspected fraudulent government contracts awarded during the previous administration. According to the clips played on the show, these contracts have now been halted. By stacking these numbers back to back like this, the source effectively builds a narrative of out-of-control federal spending that the current administration claims to be aggressively reining in. To really compound the skull of all this, California Representative Vince Fong joined the show and stated his state alone lost $32 billion to unemployment fraud. So the crucial point the broadcast made was how Fong detailed exactly where this money went. $1 billion directly to prisoners and international crime syndicates. He argued that California borrowed heavily from federal taxpayers to cover these catastrophic losses and is now trying to raise taxes on small businesses to pay it back rather than fixing the structural fraud in the first place. Section 4. Sanctuary Cities and Public Safety. Local versus federal clash. The narrative then transitioned over to sanctuary cities, examining arguments that local non-cooperation policies are direct threats to public safety. Congressman Gabe Evans, a former police officer himself, argued that policies in places like Denver are actively shielding cartel members and intentionally putting federal law enforcement in harm's way. Citing a 50% increase in Denver homicides, he detailed a specific case where a suspected trained Argo gang member was released into the public rather than being handed over to ICE. This forced federal agents to attempt a dangerous arrest in the community, which unfortunately resulted in an injured officer. Evans even claimed that Denver police are omitting nationality data on standard FBI fingerprint cards, specifically to avoid triggering federal immigration enforcement. Finally, Section 5. Honoring Our Fallen Veterans. Operation Benjamin. Concluding on a deeply unifying note, the broadcast shifted completely away from partisan politics to highlight a profound historical preservation effort. Shalom Lamb, the chief historian and co-founder of Operation Benjamin, introduced his initiative, which works closely with the American Battle Monuments Commission to correct decades-old errors in overseas military cemeteries. Following the immense chaos of World War I and World War II, many Jewish American soldiers were accidentally buried under Christian crosses. Operation Benjamin does the painstaking historical and genealogical research required to replace those crosses with the Star of David, ensuring these soldiers are remembered according to their actual faith. This quote perfectly captures the emotional weight of their work. Lamb described the profound experience of bringing families to these newly corrected graves in places like France. He highlighted how families, sometimes discovering a fallen relative they barely even knew existed, are finally able to recite the mourner's Kaddish, a traditional Jewish prayer, at a properly recognized grave, after more than a century of silence. It's an absolutely powerful testament to the idea that seeking the truth and honoring those who served has no expiration date. As we wrap up this explainer, I want you to consider how the blending of highly divisive political rhetoric with unifying human interest stories shapes the way we process modern media. We've seen how a single source can connect a debate over veganism in Texas, to naval mines in Iran, to billions in missing funds, and finally to the graves of heroes in France. The structure is entirely intentional. It informs, it aggravates, and ultimately it attempts to unify its specific audience. So I'll leave you with this to think about. When you consume information that so seamlessly connects such vastly different emotional touchpoints, how does that architecture ultimately shape your own worldview? Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and keep asking the right questions.